As I mentioned in a previous video, I'm going to do a bit more Halloween-y type content with a crossover, obviously, to ancient history. And so I thought I'd start with quite a famous werewolf story, which you may have heard. And this comes from Petronius's work, the Satyricon. And this was a satire that was written in the probably late 1st century AD. And within it, people are telling stories. And one of these individuals is an individual called Niceros. He's an ex-slave. And this refers to when he was a slave and how he had an interaction with a werewolf. I'm going to briefly summarize the story, but I also want to pick up on a couple of elements to it later on. But I'll start, obviously, with the story. If you've heard of it, you'll recognize this. And if not, it's a great story. So, to summarize, Niceros has fallen in love. He's in love with the wife of an innkeeper who's passed away, and he wants to go and visit her. But in order to do so, he has to travel at night. His master's gone away, so there's no problems there. The only issue he's got is making the journey, because he's doing so at night, so he needs someone to come along with him for a bit of safety. Luckily, in the house that he's at, there's a guest staying who happens to be a soldier who agrees to come along with him. Whilst on their way, they decide to pause and have a break. Niceros reads some of the tombstones, because tombstones are often on the side of the road. So he's reading some of those just to pass the time. And he turns around and sees that his soldier friend is doing something very different. He's making a circle of water around himself. And then he turns into a wolf, howls, and runs into the forest. This terrifies Niceros, which, I think that's a fair assessment. That's probably where I'd be. And he runs over and has a look on the floor at his clothes, and these clothes have turned to stone. Niceros is in a state of panic, but manages to make it to the home of his beloved. But when he gets there, there's been even more drama. Apparently, a wolf had been there earlier, and it had been worrying the sheep there. But luckily, someone had got out with a spear and jabbed it in the neck, so it had run off. In the morning, Niceros gets up and makes his way back home, and finds even more drama. He finds a lot of blood at his home, and that leads him to his soldier friend, who's being treated for a neck wound. Yeah, you can put 2 and 2 together on that one. And that's actually an interesting topic in itself, because that's a trope that we sometimes have in modern werewolf myths. The whole, who is it? Oh, we can work out who the werewolf is because of an injury they sustained whilst in wolf form. But there are 2 other points that I also want to talk about. The first is the moon. I didn't mention in the story, but in the story it does actually say that it was almost like day because the moon was so bright. And people have linked this to the transformation of the werewolf. However, it's much more likely and makes much more sense if we understand it as a way of Niceros being able to give his account, because if it was pitch black, he couldn't have seen anything. He certainly wouldn't have been able to read the tombstones. I don't think that it really is anything to do with the transformation of the werewolf. In fact, the moon as a way of the werewolf changing is a much more modern thing. In fact, there are many things to do with the werewolf lore or werewolf myth, which is actually far more modern than we realise, such as silver, for example. The other thing is the actual transformation itself. It seems to be a magical ritual which involves water, and there's evidence of this appearing elsewhere. In fact, there are some elements of water in other werewolf myths, particularly relating to the change of the werewolf. And also, just one more thing, he doesn't change into a half-man, half-wolf. He changes into a wolf. But back then, wolves were terrifying. I'm sure they still are to some people now, but we've kind of been sanitized a bit to them. But back in ancient Greece and Rome, wolves were a viable threat. They were very, very scary things. And again, they very, very much are in certain parts of the world. But in other parts of the world, perhaps we don't always realize that. So anyway, that's the Roman story of the werewolf. There's a Greek one, which I'll do as well. So if you like that kind of stuff, click follow. And if you want to ask any questions or leave a comment, do so as well.